I'm excited to be with you this morning. Thank you so much for coming out on a Saturday morning. I get to talk to you about one of my favorite people, William Tyndale, and my main challenge is not to take all of our time talking about him, all right? So this is a statue of him somewhere in Europe, I forget where exactly, and there's one of the more famous paintings of him. He is, as you probably know, the first to translate the Bible into English from the original languages. By the time of Tyndale, in the 16th century, the Bible had been translated into English by the followers of John Wycliffe, a name you're probably familiar with, but they had translated from Latin, not from Greek and Hebrew, whereas Tyndale makes the remarkable decision to translate from the original languages. That was a big deal at his time because Latin was very much the language of scholarship and the language of the church at the time. He left probably, I think it's fair to say, a more indelible mark on the English language and certainly on the language of the Bible in English than I would say any other single individual in history. He translates, by the time he dies, he translates the New Testament twice and also starts to make his way through the Old Testament and gets as far as 2 Chronicles. Some of you know the Old Testament's a little bit bigger, so we'll talk about why he didn't get all the way through in a minute. Some have measured, depends on partly how you measure, but some have measured that the most famous English translation, the King James Version, is something like 80% of Tyndale's work where it overlaps with his translation work. So that gives you some sense of just how significant his influence was on what we are probably more familiar with as the most famous translation. One of his biographers says that one key to Tyndale's genius is that his ear for how people spoke was so good. The English he was using was not the language of the scribe or the lawyer or the schoolmaster. It really was at base the spoken language of the people. And in fact, it's remarkable if you compare, say, his translation to even just his preface to his Bible. The language of the Bible section is actually quite a bit simpler than that of his introduction. And I think that's because he was familiar, he was so good with the original languages, he recognized the simplicity of the originals, and he really wanted to bring that out for his English readers. Now, having said that, he wasn't afraid to innovate either. And so he's responsible for coining a number of English words that you probably can't even imagine English not having. Words like anathema, or godly, or scapegoat, unbeliever, and zealous. Those are all words that Tyndale invents for the very first time ever. He's also the first one to ever use the word atonement theologically. It had been used at least once before that, but he uses it in a theological context. He's also responsible for such famous biblical lines as "Let there be light," "Fight the good fight," and he is the one who first gives us Jehovah for the name of God in the Old Testament, or you may be familiar with it as Yahweh. He also gets in a bit of trouble because he uses some new English words for things like the Greek word for church he translates as congregation instead of church. And he explicitly says, because at the time, people heard the word church and all they thought about was the hierarchy of the church. And he knew that in the New Testament, the word ecclesia, church, refers to the people. And so he translates a congregation, which was not something that made him popular among the church hierarchy, as we'll see. He translates the word senior for elder instead of priest, which had been the case before that. All right. So just to give you some sense of his significant legacy, and we'll talk a little bit more at the end here about his legacy. All right. But let's start by thinking together about his training. He begins his training in Oxford at the age of 14, which may seem amazing, but actually at the time, he's only slightly on the younger side for students at Oxford at the time. They started pretty young back then. And at the time, to give you some sense of the size of Oxford, it's not the massive university it is today. At the time, there were somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 students. He finishes with his bachelor in 1512 and then graduates with his master's in 1515. And what's important is the fact that Tyndale is going to school at Oxford, which just happens to be the same school where John Wycliffe had taught for many years and gotten himself in trouble for, among other things, advocating for the Bible in the language of the people, in English, all right? So the legacy and the memory of Wycliffe still looms over Oxford by the time that Tyndale is a student there. And then there's one other thing that's very, very important, that's very momentous in terms of history, that really sets Tyndale up for the work that he's about to do, and that is, the year after he finished his master's degree, we get the first published Greek New Testament ever, printed from the printing press, right? So remember about 100 or so years before this, Gutenberg invents the movable type printing press, okay? By Tyndale's day, in fact, when he's a student at Oxford, students are still using hand-copied books. Some of them are using printed ones if they can get them, but otherwise, if you want a textbook as a student, you don't go to the student bookstore and buy one. You find a friend who has the textbook, then you find somebody who's willing to copy it for you, and you pay them, and they make a copy, and now you have a textbook, right? So students in the room, I don't want to hear you complaining about textbooks, right? All you do is go on Amazon and buy it, all right? Tyndale had to actually go get his own made, hand-copied. But this printed Greek New Testament comes off the printing press in Europe from the hand of Erasmus, the famous Roman Catholic humanist scholar. And then the year after that, to give you some perspective, Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door at Wittenberg, right? And then 5 years later, in 1522, Luther publishes his German New Testament that will very much inspire Tyndale. So to give you some sense, there's John Wycliffe up there. Okay, so 1382 is when his Bible comes out. And then you have Tyndale's coming out in 1526, as we'll see. And a few years before that is Luther's German New Testament. By the way, this year marks the 500th anniversary of Luther's German New Testament. Really a momentous occasion for that, all right? To give you some perspective, there's Gutenberg there, and there's Columbus sailing the ocean blue, all right? So just to put things in perspective is where we are. John Foxe, you may know the name John Foxe from the famous Foxe's Book of Martyrs, written not long after Tyndale dies, tells us that William Tyndale was brought up from a child in the University of Oxford, where he, by long continuance, grew up and increased as well in knowledge of tongues, that is languages, and other liberal arts, as especially in the knowledge of the Scriptures, whereunto his mind was singularly addicted. Isn't that a wonderful phrase to describe William Tyndale? Wouldn't you love for someone to describe you that way? Singularly addicted to the Scriptures. And that was not necessarily typical, because the teaching of the Bible was not a thoroughgoing part of the curriculum at Oxford at the time. They were learning other things like the classics, they were learning law, and maybe theology, but not directly studying the Bible very much. And to give you a sense of his academic prowess, a friend later, a German friend actually, tells us that he had mastered 8 languages, along with English, of course. That includes Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Italian, Spanish, French, and German. Tyndale had a brilliant, brilliant mind. After he finishes at Oxford then, his student days, he returns home to Gloucestershire in England. And there he does something that's fairly common in the day if you've been well educated and don't become a lawyer or don't immediately become a priest or something like that or go into the royal court. He becomes a tutor for a wealthy family to tutor their children. And sometime during this period also he is ordained as a priest and begins to preach around the area of his hometown. And there are 2 really key events that happen in this period, this early period of his life. First is that someone who hears his preaching warns him that if he keeps preaching the Scriptures, it will cost you your life. And I want you to let that sink in, especially because I'm sure you know how his life does end. But I want you to just think about the fact that at this point, Tyndale is being warned that he might lose his life simply for preaching the Scriptures. It is also at this point then that something else very significant happens. A certain learned man, whose name we do not know from history, says to him these words. He says, "We are better without God's law than the popes." He says, "We're better without God's law than the popes." To which Tyndale very, very famously replies, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. And if God spare my life here many, many a year, I will cause a boy that driveth the plow to know more of the Scriptures than you do." That's a remarkable statement for a man as young as he is. The more remarkable thing is that he does it. By the time he dies, and certainly as a result of his work, the plowboy does end up knowing more of the Bible than at least the Pope of his day. I want you to think for just a second about the significance of the fact that you all, I'm sure, have probably not just one English Bible at home, but multiples. And certainly you probably have any number of them if you pulled out your phone that you could download free in a second. And we are tempted to take for granted the fact that we have such easy access to the Bible, but in Tyndale's day, that was not at all something to take for granted. At the time then, he says, of the need for the people to have the Bible in their language, he says, "I perceived by experience how it was impossible to establish the lay people in any truth unless the scripture was plainly laid before their eyes in their mother tongue, and that they might see the process, the order, and the meaning of the text, which was the only thing that moved me to translate the New Testament. In other words, what he's saying is, not only do the people need to have the Bible in their language, but they need to be able to read it. They need to have it in front of their eyes. It needs to be readable to them so they can see the process, order, and meaning of the text. One of the things that Tyndale does, and he's following others before him, is that when he publishes his first New Testament, it has marginal notes. And then he includes introductions for each of the book. Interestingly enough, by the time he does this, Tyndale is very Lutheran in his theology, and his introduction to the book of Romans ends up being longer than the book of Romans itself. Which tells you where he's being influenced by, yeah. But it's important because what Tyndale realized was he knew that this was the first time people had ever read the Bible in their own language. And it wasn't enough just to give it to them and throw them into the deep end. They were going to need help to understand it. The Bible's a big book, and if they're not familiar with it, they're going to need some help to understand it. You might say that's still what we do here at the seminary, right? In our teaching, in our training, preparing people for ministry, we are helping them understand and read the Bible, and that's what he's doing in those notes. All right, so that's his time in Gloucestershire where he's preaching. He's discovering a love for the Scriptures. He's seeing it have effect on people's lives, but he's also already encountering resistance to the ideas that are going to mark the rest of his life. So the next thing he does, he realizes he can't stay there in Gloucestershire. He needs to go to London. And there his plan is to meet the Bishop of London, one of the major leaders of the Church of England at the time. And his goal is to go there and try to secure support from him and a license to print so that he can translate the Bible and have it printed. One of the things you need to understand to appreciate what's going on at the time is you can't just go home, write a book on Microsoft Word, and hit print on your printer and hand somebody your book, do you see? Printing is a big deal. It takes a lot of work. And the only people that are allowed to do it are those who've been given permission by the throne, by the King of England, to do it. So you actually have to get permission before you can publish a book at the time, right? And so he goes to London hoping to secure permission from the Bishop of London to translate the Bible. He's already at this point produced several English translations of Greek classical works, so his skill as a translator is already evident. But the Bishop of London doesn't want anything to do with him. He never even gets a chance to meet him. At this point, he's probably already starting to work on his translation, but it becomes clear that there is not going to be any place for him to translate the Bible there. So he writes at one point that he realized not only that there was no room in my Lord of London's palace to translate the New Testament, that's the Bishop of London, but also that there was no place to do it in all of England. So he realizes the very place he wants to serve with this translation is not going to be a hospitable environment for him to do it. What's important, though, is that this time in London, about a year that he's there, is not a waste. Because during this time, he establishes some very key connections with various merchants in London who end up supporting him. They support him while he's there. He lives with them. But they then become key. Once he leaves England and translates the Bible, he has to have a way to get his Bibles back into England. Do you see? And then he has to have people who are willing to distribute them and sell them. And that's where these merchants become key to his success. As one writer says, the merchants of London, mainly in the cloth and tailoring industries, were firmly entrenched in the Lollard movement, first set in motion by John Wycliffe 150 years earlier. A movement which was in touch with the German Lutherans and which, in defiance of the English church law, was crying out for a new translation of the Scriptures. And he goes on to say that such men as these merchants, who otherwise their names are not known to us in most cases, right? You've probably not thought of the merchants as being a key part of the story of Tyndale's Bible, but they are. Without them, his Bible never could have been sold. Such men as these were to provide the financial and shipping that were crucial to the success of the enterprise, and that is how, in 1525, Tyndale finds himself in the city of Cologne, in Europe, not in England, and in a printing house of a guy named Peter Quintal, all right? So that's where he ends up. He ends up in Europe, and then he realizes there he has to print it. Then this is a picture, then, of the earliest copy we have of a Tyndale Bible. His first edition, this one, starts to be printed in 1525, but before they can even get through Matthew, although there's some indications that maybe they made it through Mark, the print shop is raided by the authorities. And so the only thing that we have surviving today of this print run is a single copy. This is it. And it goes through part of Matthew. I think it ends somewhere around Matthew 17, if I remember right. Okay? Notice it has pictures too. It's again a way to help early readers of the Bible, right? It's the first time they're reading the Bible. They need help. It's the first time then in the English language that Matthew 7:7 says, "Ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and it will be open to you." Isn't that amazing? He is, not surprisingly, he's very Lutheran in theology at this point. He is dependent on Luther's recent New Testament from a few years earlier. And so what he does is he flees from Cologne up the Rhine River to the city of Worms, the place where Luther had recently defended his theology just about 5 years before. And there he starts again, and this time he succeeds. All right? And this is a picture of his second edition. If you want to go out to the table afterwards, we've got a really nice color facsimile of this out there. This one happens to be illustrated. They weren't all in color. And the notes in the margin there have been added as well by probably the same person who colorized it. And what's especially important about this second edition, besides the fact that he finishes it and that it can be sold finally, is that it's half the size of the first one, it's well printed, and it's very affordable. To give you some sense of how affordable it was in comparison, a bound copy of this might cost something like 5 days' wages for a skilled laborer at the time. All right, that's just one way to think about it. Now, that may actually sound like a lot. Imagine 5 days of your pay to buy a Bible. That still sounds like a lot to us, doesn't it? Because again, you can download it for free on your phone. But put this in perspective, because a few centuries before, a Latin Bible might have cost somebody 15 years of that same worker's wages. 15 years, right? And then even before that, a copy of the Wycliffe Bible in English, a complete copy of the Bible, could still cost around 2 years' wages. So think about the incredible drop in price, going from costing you 2 years' wages to have a complete Bible in English to all of a sudden you can now have it for a few days of your wages, right? That is really, really significant. And thousands of them are imported into England and sold, and it was immediately condemned by the very same Bishop of London who he had tried to get permission from. In October of that year, after its release, the Bishop of London sends out a prohibition of the book, calling it, saying, "In the English tongue, it is that pestiferous and most pernicious poison dispersed throughout all our dioceses of London in great number." He had it burned on a public display at St. Paul's Cathedral there in London, an occasion at which he preached the marquee sermon to mark the occasion. Only 3 copies of this edition survive today. This is one of them. The third one, which is actually the only complete one, was only discovered in about 1996 in a German library, as it happens. Turns out one of the best places to find really old books is in old libraries. All right, so that's his 1526. Despite the instant interest, though, Tyndale does not benefit financially from it. In 1531, he writes to a friend of his poverty, exile, absence from friends, hunger, thirst, cold, and the great danger wherewith I am everywhere encompassed. All of which he suffered because he hoped, he says, with my labors to do honor to God. Isn't that remarkable? We think of him as this great towering figure, don't we? And we think this is such a monumental addition. And yet here he is at the time, and he's dirt poor, right? It's tempting to think because he's so vaulted in our memory, he must have been doing well, but he's not. It's the exact opposite, right? During this time, he publishes several theological works. He finishes his work on the Pentateuch, bringing that into English in 1530, and the opposition to him begins to only increase. His greatest critic was a man named Sir Thomas More, who wrote, listen to this, 9 volumes. 9 volumes opposing Tyndale, which his biographer tells us amount to about 500,000 words. And he says they're not all worth reading, by the way. So keep that in mind. People still read Tyndale today. They don't very often read Thomas More. But by November 1534, he had finished the second edition of his New Testament in Antwerp. He had moved by that time. He's still in exile. He's still in hiding. And interestingly, like many Bible translators, Tyndale is not happy with his first edition. He has to revise it almost right away, or wants to. In the meantime, others had started to pirate his work. A guy named, by the last name of Joy, had taken his edition and changed almost all the places where Tyndale had translated the Greek word resurrection and translated life after this life, or something like that. And Tyndale was not happy with that. But he revised it almost right away. He is, by this point, very Lutheran in his theology. And the church leaders in England are not happy with that. All right. In 1535, then, that brings us to this slide. A young man named Henry Phillips pretends to be a friend of his, pretends to be interested in Tyndale and his work, pretends to be a supporter of him. And in a turn that we cannot help but thinking of Judas's own betrayal, Henry Phillips betrays William Tyndale for a sum of money. He had apparently squandered his money in England. He had squandered his father's money in gambling and had fled England partly because of that, and had gone to Tyndale hoping to somehow get money out of him. When that doesn't work, he ends up betraying him for a sum of money. So that on May 21st, 1531, Phillips tricks Tyndale into leaving his house, and Tyndale is seized in the alleyway behind the house he had been working in. He's taken here. This is the only reliable picture I can find of where he's taken. I couldn't find a good photo. I think maybe the castle is not there. But he's taken to the castle of Vilvoorde near Brussels, and the charge is for being a Lutheran. And he's there in that castle for over a year, where he undergoes a consistent, a thoroughgoing interrogation by the Catholic leaders in that city. And one of the things you need to appreciate about the interrogation he faces in this time is that the interrogation is not designed to exonerate him. In other words, the goal is not to interrogate Tyndale and get him to recant his views, because at that point, the judgment has already been levied on him that he's going to die for his theology and for translating the Bible, and the only point of the interrogation at this point is, in their view, to save him from an eternal damnation. In other words, their hope is to get him to recant, but not so that he's spared from the gallows, but simply, in their views, to save him from eternal damnation. There's an incredibly poignant letter from Tyndale during this period. As winter approaches, he writes what is his last surviving letter. In fact, I believe it's his only surviving letter in his own hand. This is the only thing we have in Tyndale's own handwriting. It's extremely poignant. If it's okay with you, I want to take a few minutes to read some sections of it. He's writing to the lord of the castle and asking him for permission. And he says, "My overcoat is worn out. My shirts also are worn out." And he says, a friend of mine, has a woolen shirt, if he will be good enough to send it. I have also with him leggings of thicker cloth to put on above. He has also, that is his friend, has a warmer nightcaps. And I ask to be allowed to have a lamp in the evening. It is indeed wearisome sitting alone in the dark. So you see what he's asking for. He's cold. He's in this dark, damp castle in the winter, and he's starting to get really cold. But then he says, "Most of all, I beg and beseech your clemency to be urgent with the commissary, that he will kindly permit me to have the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew grammar, and Hebrew dictionary, that I may pass the time in that study. In return, may you obtain what you most desire, so only that it be for the salvation of your soul. But if any other decision has been taken concerning me to be carried out before winter, I will be patient, abiding the will of God, to the glory of the grace of my Lord Jesus Christ, whose Spirit, I pray, may ever direct your heart. Amen." Isn't that amazing? His last known letter, the only thing we have is in his own hand, as he's preparing for death, and there are two things he is concerned about: warm enough clothes and his Hebrew materials. Why? Because as he goes to his death, the main thing he's thinking about still is translating the Bible for the people of God. He wants to keep working on his Old Testament. One of the things that's key at this point to recognize about Tyndale's life is that as he goes to his death here, there is no reason at all from the circumstances to be hopeful about his own life's work. Do you see? We tend to project back onto him and assume, because he's so important to us, he must have had some sense right, of how significant his work would be. But his books at the time are being burned. His house had been raided. In fact, the last part of the Old Testament he translated in English, as far as he knew, had been conscripted. We know now that it hadn't been. It actually had gotten out before the authorities got to it, and I'll come back to that. But his house had been raided. The new Bishop of London, there's a new Bishop of London at the time, who was harsher than the one who came before. So one biographer says that a heavy curtain hung before him, through which he could see little or nothing. Isn't that amazing? I want you to think about that, because there's so many times in our lives where the work that we do that may not seem like it's going to be fruitful, right? But God knows the beginning from the end, and he can take our labors that may at the time seem like they're going nowhere and make them extremely fruitful. One can't help, or at least I couldn't help but thinking about Tyndale at this point as one of the heroes of the faith in Hebrews 11:13, of whom the writer says, "They all died in faith and received not the promises, but saw them afar off and believed them and saluted them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on earth." What a remarkable description of Tyndale at this period. And of course, that is from Tyndale's own translation. Early in October, then, he's brought out. A chain is placed on his neck, and he is strangled and burned. He's actually strangled first before he is burned as a sign of respect for him as a scholar. So they only did that for certain people. This is an engraving of it from Fox's Book of Martyrs. And you'll see, if you look closely, it's kind of a little speech bubble. It looks like a scroll coming out of his mouth. And it's too small to read probably. But what it says is, it gives you the last words that we know Tyndale said: "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." At the point he dies, Tyndale is still praying that God will open the king's eyes and help him to see that the people need the Bible in their own language. To just conclude then, and think about his legacy, it was immense. We already noticed his contribution to the English language and to English Bibles. But perhaps most remarkably, it was within months of his death, pictured here, that his friend John Rogers would print for the first time a complete English Bible with all of Tyndale's translation work, including all the way up to 2 Chronicles in the Old Testament. And more remarkable still is that a copy of Rogers' Bible, printed under the pseudonym Thomas Matthew, was sent to the new Archbishop of Canterbury. You may have heard of him. His name is Thomas Cranmer. And Cranmer gets that Bible in front of the king, and the king, who's begun to have a change of heart on the issue, approves that Bible to be sold in England, and in fact distributed to a copy in every English parish. There are about 9,000 English parishes at the time. What that means is that less than a year after Tyndale dies, his dying words are answered. The Lord does open the King of England's eyes, and his own translation, although not in his name. This is a copy of it here. There's a facsimile out on the table. This is that Matthew Bible that gets approved by the king. You probably can't tell because they're so fancy, but this is the initials WT for William Tyndale. The king apparently did not know that what was in this Bible that he approved was Tyndale's translation. The translation of the very man that had just been put to death for translating the Bible. What I want to end with then is to have you think about just how important partnership was in the success of William Tyndale's Bible. Think of the friend who sheltered him in London and may have helped finance the printing and the binding and the shipping of his Bible, and then these other merchants that we learned about from London. They all took risks to partner with Tyndale. In fact, one named Humphrey Monmouth ended up in the Tower of London for a time because of his support for Tyndale. At the time, even listening to a copy being read could be punished by death. So imagine the danger of those merchants faced who financed and shipped copies of Tyndale's Bible. It's really amazing to think about that partnership. I want to leave you with a quote from Fox's Book of Martyrs, written just a few decades after Tyndale's death. John Fox, in writing this, is comparing his day, which remember is just a few decades after Tyndale, but he's comparing himself to the decades before when people didn't have the Bible in English and didn't have easy access to it. John Fox says, "The fervent zeal of those Christian days," speaking of Tyndale's days, "seemed much superior to these our days and times." Thinking about the good old days is not new, is it? "As manifestly may appear by their sitting up all night and reading and hearing, also by their expenses and charges and buying of books in English, of whom some gave 40 pounds, or the equivalent of $7,000 for us today, if my math is right. Some more, some less for a book. Some gave a load of hay for a few chapters of James or of St. Paul in English." Can you imagine that? Probably can't imagine giving hay. But imagine giving money for just a little piece of the Bible. "To see their travails, their earnest seekings, their burning zeal, their readings, their watching, their sweet assemblies, may make us now in these days of free possession," that is free possession, easy possession of the Bible, "to blush for shame." Isn't that remarkable? John Fox is writing that in 1563. Imagine how much more we might blush in thinking about their zeal for the Word of God. I'm going to turn it over to John now, but I just want to leave you by thinking that's what we are here to talk about today. The Text and Canon Institute exists to help people better understand and appreciate how we got the Bible, with the ultimate goal that they will read it and have their lives transformed. William Tyndale gave his life. I pray none of us in this room have to give our lives for this work. But nevertheless, I hope as John shares about an update on what we've been doing here, that you'll see how we are a small part of that line that stands in Tyndale's of getting the Word of God to the people of God.